In Chapter 13, we'll look at climate change in the living world. We'll look at terrestrial ecosystems, growing season length, CO2 and nitrogen fertilization, complex ecosystem responses to climate change, polar pest migration, and more. We'll also look at aquatic ecosystems, saving the ocean acidification part for a med-ed lesson after this lecture. We'll look at coral bleaching, freshwater systems, and also changes in the water cycle in general. As an introduction, CO2 levels would not be lethal to humans until it reaches 15 times the present levels. So we're not getting there with burning the fossil fuels that are available to us today. So that's not the problem. But there will be changes in the living world in response to increases in CO2 and changes in temperature and humidity that go with that. Plants generally grow faster with more CO2. Now in a lab, that definitely is true. You can pump more CO2, and since it's a critical nutrient, it will grow faster. However, the ecosystem response to climate change and CO2 could be quite different. Can animals and plants adapt or migrate fast enough to outpace the climate zone shifts? History generally tells us no. Many of the large extinctions happened during big climate shifts. So what influence will all the roads and land degradation that are on top of a climate shift right now have? Growing season length. 35% of plants are in the northern hemisphere midlats, so that's why I'm focusing on this part here. Plants that leaf and bloom based on internal temperatures are blooming earlier each year. Of course, this makes sense as the temperature increases. For the northern US, the green up is about 8 hours earlier each year. This is good for some plants because they have more time to grow, but generally bad for the ecology in general. An example would be long-distance migratory birds that are not in tune with the local ecology. They expect to find what they've always found over time, and now they're showing up and finding their favorite plants have already bloomed well before they arrive. These two graphs are showing this effect over time. In 1850, the first flowering date by Thoreau was shown to be the 15th of May at Walden Pond in Massachusetts, and then over time, to the most recent study, the flowering date has moved up significantly to the 5th of May. So flowers are blooming earlier. Same effect in Wisconsin is found with a number of studies here looking at the flowering date happening earlier in the spring. You can see there's a big spread around the average here depending on what's happening in any given year. However, enough samples have been shown over time to establish a strong average with not much deviation on that average itself. In other words, the more samples you take, the more confident you are in that average, and there is a statistical difference in the flowering date over time as a result. CO2 fertilization. Most plants grow faster when exposed to higher atmospheric CO2, if other nutrients are readily available as well. Part of this is simply due to increasing that critical nutrient CO2, and part of it is due to less active uptake of CO2 needed. Thus, the plants can open their stomata, where they exchange gases and evaporate water. They can open these less widely. This allows the plants in general to grow in dry conditions as water is not lost as easily. In other words, since there's so much CO2 around, they don't need to expose themselves to evaporation as much by opening their stomates, and therefore they can conserve water and grow better when there's more CO2 in general. Now it turns out there's two primary kinds of plants out there. C3 plants, 95% of the world's plants are C3. They produce a 3-carbon atom compound, while C4 plants, which are only 1% of the world's plants, produce a 4-carbon atom compound. It turns out that C4 plants can photosynthesize with much less CO2 than C3 plants can. In that sense, C4 plants are much less responsive to increases in CO2 than are C3. This means that the C3 plants are more sensitive to ambient CO2 concentrations, and they should have an advantage as CO2 concentrations increase. Examples of C3 plants are rice, critical crop, wheat, and soybean. So that's good news for them in general. C4 plant examples would be sugarcane, also a viable crop, especially in South America. Corn, obviously an important part of the US economy, and switchgrass as well. So part of this dilemma is that many weeds, or most weeds in general, are C3 plants. So more money could be spent in the future on weeding by farmers because they're going to grow fast as CO2 increases. Certain economically important C4 plants like sugarcane and corn could be at a disadvantage to C3 weeds as that CO2 increases. This study from the journal Vegetation considered increased growth resulting from a 100% increase in the level of CO2. They showed that C3 plants, the proportional increase was 41%, with the C4 plants being less sensitive to those increases in CO2, only growing at 22%. So it'll be interesting to see how this propagates forward in the future as CO2 levels continue to rise. Beyond this, we have an effect called nitrogen fertilization. Molecular nitrogen naturally makes up 79% of the composition of air. That is not fixed nitrogen, however. Bacteria in soil can fix this nitrogen into more usable forms. So this molecular nitrogen isn't that usable to plants. Something has to be done to it, and typically bacteria will fix the nitrogen to make it more usable for plants. However, adding fertilizer to soil artificially adds fixed nitrogen to boost growth. Lots of problems when this runs into rivers and ocean. For example, algae grows exponentially, then while it decomposes, it uses up a lot of the oxygen and you end up with dead zones. This is a big problem in rivers coming out of agricultural zones, where you'll have dead zones in the ocean because they're low in O2. Now this could be constrained by humans because we're talking about people adding fertilizer, and they could change their types of fertilizer and adjust to this. However, the other effect is that industrial emissions from smokestacks give off fixed nitrogen too. This ends up raining out, and then it rains out into wild areas and helps increase rapid growth in the wild areas as well. So that's kind of an anthropogenic effect that is not as well constrained by farmers because it's well spread by the smokestacks from industrial pollutants. Now, thinking about an entire ecosystem is much more difficult. With increased CO2, plant growth generally increases and plant use of water becomes more efficient. Like I said, the stomata open less widely and they can conserve water better. However, the effects of elevated CO2 and temperature on ecosystem and precipitation amounts too are much more complex. So an ecosystem response is way harder to figure out than looking at plants in a lab. As an example of this, we can look at changes in speciation within forests. Aside from C3 and C4 issues, different plants will respond differently to changes in temperature and moisture that are expected to occur as CO2 increases. This is a study from Minnesota. The first plot in the upper right here shows what will happen in clays with high soil moisture retention property as CO2 increases, but also as temperature increases, and also the evaporation rate increases, which will try to dry out the soil. Now, those high temperatures have a hard time drying out clays because they have that high soil moisture retention. But what was shown over time was that plants that prefer cold, like aspen and spruce, were eventually overwhelmed by plants that grow better in warmer conditions like maple and birch and basswood, and so the speciation changed significantly. However, in sands that have low soil moisture retention, a different forest here, they also showed kind of a difference in speciation over time. However, eventually, when temperatures got warm enough, and they're projecting in the future here, modeling this, as temperatures got too warm, too much evaporation occurred and nothing could grow very well because there simply wasn't enough moisture in the soil. Point I want you to get out of this is that the speciation changes definitely will happen because there are some plants that will take advantage of warmer temperatures, more CO2, but eventually, depending on what kind of soils you have, there could be catastrophic events in areas that don't have high soil moisture retention because as the earth warms, the evaporation rate from that soil increases so much, even if you're in a zone that has more precipitation in the future, those higher temperatures will tend to have evaporation overwhelm that and dry out the soil. In other places where there's high soil moisture retention, you may not see that effect of dying out of the forest. In fact, you might have more forest grow. It will just be a different forest than it was when it was colder. So the major point here is that species distribution within forests is very likely to change for a variety of complicated reasons. Another notable point, can species migration keep pace with warming, even with forest dissection farms and highways? So this is something we can't really look in the deep past to look at changes in forests with different climate change in the deep past, because now we have all these forest dissection areas that make it even more challenging to figure out how this might evolve over time. Now I want to spend some time having you look at this ecosystem video from the U.S. Geologic Survey that looked at the potential effects of rising CO2 and climate change on coastal wetlands.